What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I'm feeling like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Wise here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I have Chris Heivly, and Chris is the co-founder of MapQuest. He wrote the book, Build the Fort, which we're going to talk about, and started the Startup Factory, many more things. And Chris, before I formally introduce you, I always like to mention other episodes people should check out of the podcast. In the spirit of helping startups, I mean, you've talked to thousands and thousands of founders and startups, and you still were saying you do 8 to 10 a week, which is incredible. In the spirit of helping startups, people can check out the episode I did with Yuri Adoni. He's the author of The Unstoppable Startup. He was a partner at Jerusalem Venture Partners for 12 years. That's a great episode to check out. I also had Troy Vossler, who co-founded Generator, which is an accelerator community in Wisconsin. And I know you're all about tier 2 cities, even tier 3 cities, and creating that startup community. So we're going to talk more about your thoughts and cities people should check out, and even maybe other accelerators people should check out, because you obviously have the Startup Factory and help TechStars too. And before we get to it, this episode is brought to you by Rise 25. At Rise 25, we help businesses give to and connect their Dream 100 relationships. And how do we do that? We actually help you run your podcast. We're an easy button for a company to launch and run a podcast. We do the strategy, we do the accountability, and the full execution. Chris, we call ourselves the magic elves that work in the background to make it look easy for the host and the company. And, for me, the number one thing in my life is relationships. I'm always looking at ways to give to my best relationships. And I have found no better way over the past decade to profile the people and companies I most admire on this planet and share with the world what they're working on. Hopefully they learn something, just like they will with Chris's book. And so if you've thought about podcasting, you should. If you have questions, you can go to rise25.com. And just formally, let me introduce Chris before we jump in. But Chris Heivly is the nation's leading expert, one of the nation's leading experts on launching startups, and he's dubbed the Startup Whisperer. He co-founded MapQuest. If you remember MapQuest, I still, Chris, when I look at Google Maps or Waze, I still say, hey, tell my wife, can you go to MapQuest? Can you pull up Map? I still use the term MapQuest, synonymous with any mapping system. Which sold to AOL for $1.2 billion. He's an angel investor, ran a corporate venture fund, 2 micro venture funds, directed over $75 million. Is recently senior VP of innovation with TechStars. I mentioned, started the Startup Factory, and also wrote the book, Build the Fort, the Startup Community Builders Field Guide for founders, investors, and economic development leaders to better accelerate their ecosystem. So, Chris, thanks for joining me.
Jeremy, thanks for having me. I can't wait to tell some stories.
So let's start with there's so many stories behind why geography major, how did you start MapQuest? How did you start the Startup Factory? And I know you did like a tour of looking at companies to invest in, but I want to start with the book, Build the Fort, and the Startup Community Builders Field Guide. Why'd you write the book?
It's actually pretty simple. I could start one company and have that impact. I can invest in a handful and have that impact. But if I can help a community that helps 100 entrepreneurs, that's a big impact. And I've been doing that for about 7 or 8 years as a consultant to help communities create the conditions where more startups can, launch and survive. And my goal is, if I can kind of help create 1,000 new entrepreneurs a year, then that feels like a great way to do so. And the way to share that is through a book. And that's why I wrote it. Plus, I like the process of writing.
That's, we were talking before we hit record about we overcomplicate things. I'd love to hear some of the big mistakes you have found after talking to 1,000 entrepreneurs, after your own endeavors. What are the big mistakes founders make with their companies?
Yeah, I mean, and the whole idea of build a fort, it's a metaphor for when we're 10 and 12 years old, when we're out there building outside or inside forts, right? Blanket, chair upside down on the couch, broomstick holding the blanket up, or, for me, kind of borrowing wood from the local, house that's being built, getting that into the woods and building something. I just started thinking about a number of years ago. It became a metaphor that another friend of mine who was a developer, he and I would use when we were riffing on new ideas. And the first thing is, okay, where are we going to steal the wood? Let's kind of get back at the stealing part and maybe back away from that for a second. But the idea is, as adults, Jeremy, let's give an example. So you and I, channel your inner 10-year-old. It's a summer day. I knock on your door and I say, hey, you want to build a fort? And you say,
let's do it.
Right. It took you about a nanosecond to say yes. Now let me do the adult version. Hey, Jeremy, I got this idea. I don't know if it's any good, right? But, what do you think about building a fort? I'm not sure where we put it or where we're going to get the wood or, right? That's the adult version. Like our dino brains kick in and all these responsibilities we have start to cloud. And I just think if we could maybe channel that 10-year-old or 12-year-old version of ourselves, be a little bit more curious, have no fear, and there's 5 lessons in Build the Fort, and just kind of keep it really simple. Get out and find some friends to do things with. I think we take that into our startup idea, which everyone has one in their brain rattling around. I just think things might actually get off the ground and get in motion.
Talk about the 5 lessons for a second.
Yeah, so they're really simple, right? Lesson 1 is share the idea without any fear or inhibition. The last part, the fear and inhibition, is the hard part. And I don't mean share it with 3 people. I mean, go share it with 15 people, right? Get out there and just ask. And the feedback you're going to get is going to amazingly help you refine and explain it better and maybe even put it on a little bit of a path. Second thing is find some people to do it with. While you're explaining to the people, a number of them are going to go, wow, I'd like to help you do that, right? They'll become your future partners, right? Third is find the assets you need that are closest to you. The equivalent today would be in building a fort with, don't go to ask your parents for $1,000 for all the wood from Home Depot and the nails and the fort kit design, right? Just find the stuff that's laying around closest to you. Again, metaphorically, think about that in terms of your startup. You all have some assets that are there. When you take too long to find what you think are the right things, that's a barrier. Okay. 4, keep the scope really small, right? When you're building the fort, we didn't worry about whether it had a bathroom or a kitchen or whether the roof leaked. We tried our best, right? And maybe you would iterate and evolve to something better over time. But think about your 10 or 12-year-old self. If you didn't have a fort by the end of 2 or 3 days, right, you were out, right? It has to be simple. And then 5, just go do it. Don't ask permission. Don't look for validation per se. Just take that first step, that action. It's amazing what happens after the first step. It's a second step and a third step. And the next thing you know, you got a little confidence, a little momentum, and you never know what things are going to happen after that.
I love number 4, I think. I feel like I have fallen in this trap. I've seen other people fall in this trap of starting to build something and realize, oh, this would be cool. This would be cool. And before you know it, it's overcomplicated and the scope is bigger than you started out with. Can you think of any companies you've talked to where you gave them advice that you saw them going that direction where they were not keeping the scope small, especially in the beginning?
Well, let's be clear that all of us who have an entrepreneurial bent have this vision that's about 3 to 5 years from now, right? When the UPS driver shows up every day with the boxes of money, right? When every piece of marketing is working perfectly and, finance guys are counting. And the question is that, yes, you need that vision, that dream to get started. But what the hell do I need to do over the next 3 months? I love the number 3, right? So in every company I work with, so I was just working, just literally an hour ago, working with Tyler, who's got a very cool company called Closewise. And Tyler's building some software for to help in the real estate closing, right? And that whole process and scheduling. And it's got some cool AI technologies applying. And he's like, I need to raise some money. And, and then he explained that 90% of the money was going to be to build more features. And I said, let's slow your roll a little bit. If you build value, right? Like that's the first thing. Build a relationship with a future customer. They don't care how bad it looks. I ask everyone out there, go into like the time machine or whatever and look at the first maps that MapQuest produced. By today's standards, they are so ugly, so coarse, right? I mean, you guys will laugh when you go do this. And I always put that in my speeches, like when I speak from stage, I always put like an old map. I'm like, this was cool. Why was it cool? Feature-wise, it was ugly as sin. But now you could do this at home instantaneously instead of having to go to AAA. The value so far exceeded the feature or the look, right? So that was the advice I gave to Tyler. Let's figure out how to spend more time with customer and making sure they engage and have the value, and a little less time on more features.
With those 5 lessons, let's talk about MapQuest for a second. This is before you had learned all these lessons, right? So let's overlay those 5 lessons with MapQuest for a second.
Yeah, let's in this case, let's do what I say, not what I did. Because, okay, first of all, Jeremy, MapQuest was 26 to 27 years ago now. Okay. Just everything was different. So it's really funny when someone says, oh my God, you helped grow MapQuest and put it in play. I'd really love to ask you, like, how did you acquire customers? And I just laugh. And I was like, first of all, we were completely lucky. We literally threw it up there, right? And saw what happened. You can't do that today. There's too many other people doing the same thing. We had what we all know now as first mover advantage. That doesn't really exist today. But in terms of the rule or the lessons in Build the Fort, we had no fear whatsoever. Okay. And in that fear, we were all kind of map geeks. We're in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the technology hub of South Central PA, right? Obviously, on parallel with Boston and the Valley and Chicago. But we had no fear. And I know that looking back, we just tried stuff. We built a whole bunch of forts. Before MapQuest, we put the first CD-ROM mapping software out there. Before that, we rolled computers with laser printers into the back offices of every one of those auto clubs. So our journey didn't start with MapQuest. It started many years before. And we did smart things. At one point, I headed out to the West Coast to talk to Apple and Sony and Broderbund, which was the big producer of CD-ROMs back in the time that none of the kids, no one remembers that. But we learned from them. We built relationships. We knew our stuff. They knew their stuff. Let's figure out how to put it together. Again, we started simple. And then we tried stuff without any fear, right? We just went and did it. Maybe there weren't that many map geeks around. Maybe there's a handful at the time, but we had a lot of confidence in what we can do. So I think in hindsight, we applied many of the things that I talk about in Build the Fort.
Oftentimes what a company starts off as is not what it ends up being. And you mentioned that with MapQuest. Can you just quickly go through the evolution? You mentioned from CD-ROM to Auto Club to what was the next evolution?
Let's reverse those. We started with Auto Clubs, right? I think technology usually first replicates before it innovates. So we just wanted to imitate the triptych that AAA and many other, and I think there was 15 auto clubs at the time, Sears, Montgomery Wards. Who are they? Allstate. They all had these auto clubs and they had this little map service. I needed to go from Chicago to Disney World down in Orlando on the road trip. How do I get there? Where do I stop along the way? Where are the hotels? They provided that service. It was very archaic. So we automated that. We took maps that we already had in-house in this mapping company that we were part of. And we automated that. And they were ugly black and white maps, but they're a little more personalized. You got a slightly different version than someone else going from Chicago to Orlando because of the things you wanted. And we gave them some points of interest and things, again, that weren't typically, you had to work that for yourself. So we sold that to every single auto club. And it was a multi-million-dollar business, but not huge by today's standards. And then, this is now the early 90s. And then we said, all right, I did that trip out to California. And we started learning that now your desktops were going to have CD-ROMs. And we said, geez, we can jam all of this map stuff on one CD-ROM. Now you don't have to go into this AAA store. Now you can do it at home the night before, right? So now we move the power from an expert, so in an office, to you at home. By the way, we had a couple failures along the way. We had the top selling product on the Apple Newton. Now, Jeremy, do you remember that?
No, I don't.
The Apple Newton was kind of like your phone, about 3 times bigger. It was your first handheld device. I think it's one of the biggest failures in Apple's history. It was not released during Steve Jobs' time, coincidentally. But in that, we kept getting smaller footprint in terms of how to do map stuff quickly, how to write software smaller. And so in 1995, we started seeing this internet. We said, well, let's try that. And we created the URL MapQuest. So let's, for those of you who are a little more geeky, let me paint a picture. It's 1996. We're in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We're in a cubicle farm. We have a server that costs $15,000 that calculates the route when you put in 2 locations. We have another server from Silicon Graphics that creates the GIF image, right, that you get. They're in the last cubicle in the back corner, daisy chained together, right, with a couple internet connections, and splitters and power, because there's no such thing as a data center. So what are the things you're trying to figure out? And by the way, we were buying one of those about every other week at 15 grand a piece because traffic just exploded. And you're trying to figure out stuff on the fly. So even in 1996, no data centers, no experts on load balancing and servers. You're just trying to hold on for dear life.
That's pretty cool. Pretty cool journey. And at that time, the big player is AOL. So how did AOL then come into the picture? Because eventually, MapQuest sold to AOL for, like I mentioned, $1.2 billion.
Well, the first thing we did is we took it public. That's when I left the company. I was sitting on the board the last few years. I was representing our largest shareholder on the board, and then I was learning how to do venture capital. Excuse me. And they needed adults on the board, so I left the board. And to take it public, they needed old guys. I was probably 35 at the time, and so then we took it public, and then AOL bought it off the public markets about a year later. AOL's, I had a relationship with AOL. Again, if you're doing your executive role right, you're just talking to lots of people. You're sharing things. It may not be a match today, but it could be a match tomorrow. I remember sitting in Steve Case's partner, who owns the Wizards and the Capitals today. Blanking on, of course, his name right now. But I remember sitting in his office. He was looking for an investment. I was working for an investment corporate venture fund at the time, and just said, you guys should take a look at MapQuest. What the match is AOL's business model was advertising. The more pages you looked at, the more ads they sold. And nothing was bigger than a bundle of 8 to 12 pages, right, of map directions with advertising. So their interest was, I want all those pages and all those eyeballs.
Totally. With number 2 of your lessons, find people to do it with. How did you meet your co-founder?
Yeah, so the funny little backstory of MapQuest was it was baked inside of an existing mapping company called Donnelly Cartographic Services. And so inside this $6 billion printing company called R.R. Donnelly out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was a mapping company that made maps for National Geographic, for the front end of those phone books. Kids out there, just ask your parents what a phone book is. National Park Service, National Geographic, all of these kind of Mac publishers, we made the maps for them. So my co-founders kind of were within that company. And it was 3 or 4 of us that got together who said, geez, we can start to use computing technology to do a lot of things, not only make our map making process cheaper and faster, but there's other products and services we might be able to imagine. And, I don't think we talked about it, but, I was a geography major. I had an undergraduate and a graduate degree in geography, but I learned how to write code in the late 70s and early 80s. So the combination of this mapping and computing was something that, even though we talked about MapQuest in 96 and the CD-ROM in 93, I had been kind of jamming these two things together for over 10 years at that point.
I think I remember you had said, you went to your, I think, dad and said you're going to be a geography major. And he said, do computers.
Yeah.
That was early on. Why did he say that at that time? What year we're talking, like the early 80s? Why would he even, people weren't thinking about computers then.
Yeah. My dad was really well read and one of the most curious people I'd ever met in my life. He was never done getting curious about something and diving in. His brother, my uncle, was a geographer as well. And at the time was getting a PhD in geography, was also very computer oriented. So I was probably maybe a little inspired by him. I think he didn't want me to be a geographer per se. I think he said, I've watched my brother just sit there and do the academic thing. But I was never going to be the academic. So when he said computers, I said, no way. But, I found it anyway. So, probably a father-son typical interaction back in the, in your 20s.
After MapQuest, you, I think it was after MapQuest, you moved to Chicago and did a road tour. Can you talk about that and some of the companies you met along the way?
Yeah. So, our largest investor, R. Donnelly, we had spun MapQuest out by then. They asked me to come up and said, hey, if I gave you $25 million to invest in internet companies in the late 90s, post MapQuest, would that be something cool to do? And the answer was obviously yes. I have a little bit of what I call career ADD, where I'm curious, maybe like my father, and I want to go explore things. So, we're based in Chicago, but I spent most of my time out in San Francisco running up and down 101 and looking at companies. I was in Yahoo when it was 25 people. Google hadn't even been created yet. I saw Google when it was 35 people. It's a hell of a, that money thing, that, investment instrument, if you will, gets you into a lot of places, and you get to see, hundreds and hundreds of companies and hear how they're thinking and see how good founders are doing things and maybe not so good founders are doing the wrong things. And Jeremy, it was just one heck of an experience. Other than the airplane miles, it was great.
That's wild. I mean, you were seeing really the birth of the internet and some of the biggest tech giants at the time. So you were interacting with Yahoo and Google. Who else did you come across? What other companies?
Well, there's lots. I mean, there's lots of little companies. In fact, one of the last investments I made, circa 1998 or 9, I later on, Donnelly wanted to get rid of the venture, all the investments. So I kind of sold them to a group of people, some individually, some as a package. We had about 14 or 15 investments at the time, but one of them just exited like within the last year and a half. So, what's that? Almost 30 years, maybe more like 22 years, 23 years. Anyway, very good friends of mine sat on the board and as a company called Canto, and they just dealt with photographs and images and let you kind of, gather them and manage them as a corporation, marketing departments and such. And they pivoted 3 or 4 times, but they had an office in San Francisco, an office in Germany, made trips to Berlin but you find these companies, and the reason we like that one is it matched most of Donnelly's customers who were content producers, right? So I needed to find that intersection of technologies that were helping our customers. And Jeremy, I think you'd like this line. The way that I talked about our venture capital unit is we're making investments in companies that are ships over the horizon that you can't see yet. But by the time you see it, it's too late for you to get involved in it. So I'm your scout, right? I'm making these investments. We're going to make, these 10 to 14 investments over the 3 or 4 years. And some of these are going to teach you where your customers are going to go. And it was a great kind of corporate innovation tool.
What was Google like at that time? You said it was 35 people. Do you remember some of what you had seen at the time?
No, I mean, I remember that it just didn't faze me. It didn't, wrongly, obviously. It just, why do we need, a better search engine? We got lots of search engines at the time, and one flavor is no different than the other. Obviously, we didn't see the advertising, the sponsored ads, the paying, for placement. We hadn't seen that yet. AOL, Yahoo, Ask Jeeves. If you remember any of these, right? There's 4 or 5 really good search engines. To me, it was not remarkable at 35.
Yeah. I want to talk about the second-tiered cities, and it kind of goes back to your book a little bit. Can you talk about visiting Alabama?
Yeah. So from 2017 through about 2021, I worked with TechStars to say, and I've been building the Raleigh-Durham ecosystem with a group of people. TechStars is doing Boulder and then starting to, move into other cities. We had this, very small amount of people who understood what the importance of an entrepreneurial ecosystem was to a city, why that was a vital component of their kind of economic strategy. And people were starting to call each of us individually to say, how do we do this? How can we catch up? How can we create the next Silicon Valley? We said, okay, first thing is stop saying that, because you're not going to do that. But that doesn't mean you can't do something magical. And, prior to, I'm a weird one in that most people doing what I did during my time frame would have migrated to Silicon Valley, right, at some point. For some reason, I fought that off. So as we start going around and talking to all these people, I get to Birmingham, Alabama, probably about 5 years ago, pre-pandemic. And I spent a day and a half, 2 days there, met with leaders. So by leaders, I mean like government, like the mayor, right? Also a twice exited 30-year-old entrepreneur who's now on his third one, who had bought a building for entrepreneurs to gather, university, college people, and everyone, investors, all the people that make up for a great ecosystem. And Jeremy, over those 2 days, I was just blown away by the support, the collaboration, the lack of ego, the collective mission to grow Birmingham to whatever level, it can be optimized to be an entrepreneur ecosystem. And I'm going to tell you now, sometime 5, 10, I don't know, years from now, we're going to sit there and go, oh my God, they're doing some magical stuff there. And it's Birmingham, Alabama, right? And that gives me confidence and comfort that really any city, tier 2 and tier 3, can do this if they do it right.
What are some accelerators people should maybe check out? When I think of that, obviously the Y Combinator comes to mind. The TechStars comes to mind. I think TechStars is all over the country. What are some of the other accelerators? And obviously you have the Startup Factory. What are some other accelerators that maybe people don't know about?
Yeah, so I'll qualify this by saying I'm a little snobby. I've run my own, the Startup Factory, and then I spent time under the tent of TechStars. And you're right, TechStars and Y Combinator are like the Harvard and MITs, and then pretty much there's a couple mid-tiers, and then there's everyone else, right, tied for last. And though I thought I did a good job at the Startup Factory, when you peek your head underneath the tent of something, that machine called TechStars or Y Combinator, you go, oh, this is, if you're a baseball fan, it's like going from AA to the majors. You're like, oh, that's what a 97 mile an hour fastball looks like, right? Right. Or a 95 mile an hour slider. That there's a whole nother game being played. In tier two cities, my favorite run right now is Generator. I brought them into some of the cities that I've worked with. I've seen their work. They're doing a very, very good job. They understand how to serve founders, which is what every great accelerator does. So I look for them, and their model is to work in these tier two and tier three cities. So those are the three that I like: TechStars, Y Combinator, and Generator. Be careful the local homegrown ones. They're like double A. Expect what you're going to get out of that double A. Don't expect you're getting major league, results from a double A service.
What made you leave Chicago?
Well, after 10 years, Jeremy, it turns out I figured out that it's really cold and gray for about 6 months of the year.
More like 8, but yeah.
Well, it's funny. I say 6 and my wife says 8. Two things conspired together. It really was weather. My wife just said, I love this town, but I can't do this anymore. We have to go south. We have to go warm. We have to go something with more sunshine. But for me personally, and I say this jokingly, but there's a lot of seriousness in it. In 2004 and 5, I was running around doing something else, looking for something interesting to do. And I couldn't find anybody who knew what the internet was really at any scalable level. This is pre-Groupon and 1871 and all the great things that Chicago has going for it now. It didn't exist. And, it's fundamentally still a manufacturing town, isn't it? And, at least at the time, 15 years ago, very manufacturing oriented. So as I mentioned before, entrepreneurs also get to decide where they go. And so I said, let's go to greener pastures. Turns out I made a spreadsheet, about 50 cities, and it was either going to be Boulder or Raleigh-Durham, specifically Chapel Hill in North Carolina. I'm from Philadelphia. My wife's from Rochester, New York. We decided staying on the East Coast would probably be smarter for our aging parents and access to them.
Yeah, I was just in Boulder. It is beautiful there, but it did hail on us, so maybe you made the right choice in North Carolina. Let's talk about the startup factory. And I'd love to talk about some of the companies that have been involved or have benefited from the ecosystem there. Can you talk about written word media?
Yeah, so really what the book's about is that anybody can play a role and should play a role in being a leader to help build their startup community or entrepreneur ecosystem. And Ricky Woolman is a great example with her company, Written Word Media. So I met Ricky, great attitude, very giving, had what we call TechStars, a give first piece of her, right? That said, listen, I'm willing to, and I would bring her in to talk to my 5 to 7 companies at the startup factory. We did 7 cohorts of about 5, 42 companies total went through our program over 4 years. And Ricky would come in and give about 3 hours of her time to talk about marketing and and then she'd say, listen, and I'll give you each of you an hour after this of one-on-one time. And if then something happens after that, then we can figure out a transaction to help you out. But I'm going to teach you as much as I can about what the role marketing has in your startup at this point. And she was fantastic. Interesting story is that she, at the time, Facebook changed their whole algorithm about how they do advertising. She's like, how can I serve my clients if I don't know how to do this myself? So she created a sandbox. She was an avid reader. And the sandbox was, how do I help authors who usually give their books free for a day or a week on Amazon? How do I help them promote that? Something simple. And the next thing you know, it turns into a company. What I love about Ricky and the written word story is that now I had something I can help her with, right? I can help her and do that without any transaction or, just me being part of the community and introduce her to people and, from potential employees to customers to strategists to whatever the heck she needed. And I think if she was sitting here today, she would say that the first year or so of her company benefited by being part of a very, very good community that was very helpful and supportive of each other's and would give first without asking for something in return.
Love it. And I want to talk about Archive Social and Anil and a bit about his journey.
Well, just to show you that entrepreneurs come from all different places. I think a lot of people think that most entrepreneurs are 25-year-old computer science guys, right? Now, maybe we had two of those right with Anil, but Anil worked for IBM, Georgia Tech master's degree in computer science, super smart. We had met, I do these office hours. He had pitched me one of the ideas and I just went, I'm not crazy about that one, but here's how I would figure that out. He still laughs about that. But then he came with another idea, which I thought was really interesting, which is that governments and large institutions are required by law to archive all of their email. And what he was thinking is, all right, coming soon, this is now circa 2012, maybe close, 2012, our first cohort of the Startup Factory, he was going to archive those government and large institutions' social media. Because legally, if they hadn't had a rule or regulation then, it was coming. So he got in front of that, did a fantastic job, built up a great company, and had a very nice exit a few years ago. So he's our poster child for what you can do in, a tier 2 community, still very tier 3-ish maybe at the time, and a building community. But we all rallied around him in terms of helping him, with advice and investment and, all the things you need kind of as you're kind of trying to scale your business.
That's super interesting, Chris, because I always am intrigued by the non-sexy companies like archiving social media. Like it's a necessity for some of these companies, but it's just not the sexiest industry. That stuff fascinates me.
Well, it's funny. That's exactly what people say, what do you look for? I'm like, I'm happy playing in small, unsexy industries that are going to be automated on the later end of this automation, right? I still think there's hundreds of opportunities. There's still things happening in companies that are using a spreadsheet and email to communicate stuff, right? So I think not being in New York and the Valley, we had to concentrate on some of these like singles and doubles.
It's cool. Also, you mentioned Tyler earlier, and that's definitely, I feel like the real estate industry. I'm still signing documents like in person, and even had to open like a checking account at the bank. I mean, they don't use DocuSign or anything. It's kind of crazy. So there's definitely something there ripe for the picking. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, well, hopefully Tyler's going to figure it out. But that's go back to build the fort. Like many of us, the ideas come from something we're sitting in today, and we look at this and go, "That's really stupid. Why are we still doing it that way in today's age?" All right, start thinking about that. Start talking to some people. Maybe there's a little slice that you can kind of wedge into.
I want to, I'm going to pull up my screen for a second, and people can check out Chris's website. And you go to heivly.com. It's HEIVLY.com. And I'm on the books page here, but if you want to learn more, he's got some, I don't know how you come up with these images on this is my favorite one. Chris, this one here, don't alienate your community with the accidental power of law. This is a great image here. But check out his blog and some of the writings. But the book here, I want to talk about Brad Feld. Brad Feld wrote the foreword for your book and some of the learnings you've had from Brad. He's one of the co-founders of TechStars.
You bet. And by the way, a longtime investor, mostly technology-oriented companies in Boulder, one of the Boulder kind of OGs, if you will, and also a prolific blogger and author. I mean, his Venture Deals book is a must read for every new entrepreneur who wants to go raise money. You go do that. Brad is someone, this is the power of connectivity. In 2009, when I was reading about Y Combinator and TechStars with the idea of putting together the Startup Factory in Raleigh-Durham, I got introduced to Brad and David Cohen, who was the CEO of TechStars at the time, and they became good friends and they became allies. And what was amazing, Jeremy, is that David Cohen said, "Here's how we run TechStars. Here's our whole playbook. Go take it." Right? This is not a competitive zero-sum game kind of thinking. And where David gave me advice and thoughts on how to put together a great accelerator program, Brad was starting to think about what made for the qualities of a good ecosystem. He later wrote a book called Startup Communities, and then a follow-up book called Startup Community Way about this that I partnered with him on. And he's really, like I tell him, he's the grandfather of Raleigh-Durham in a way, and what we've been able to accomplish, because he seeded in me attitudes and a mindset that I could then, carry on throughout the community, which made for someone like Ricky Woolman the ability to connect with 5 or 6 people to help her, scale her business, or Anil Chawla. So Brad's a heck of a smart guy. And what was fun is that, my 5 years at TechStars was about me reaching back out to them and saying, hey, I'm kind of bored. There's something I need to do next. And the next thing you know, David Cohen and TechStars and his staff, Nicole Glaros, and Brad and I decided, let's start a consulting business to help other people in other cities, because they're coming to us for advice. And to get a chance to work with Brad was just, it's one of those times like, hey, do you want to go up and hang out with, I'm using this baseball analogy all day. I don't even know why, but, do you want to go play in the major leagues with, with Roger Clemens? And you're like, shit, yeah. So that he's a great friend and a good colleague, and super smart. And it just sets the right mindset for you, and helps you with that. And that's what really my book's about, the mindset, about how each of us can take a role to play in building our individual community.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what you say in one of the 5 lessons, which is share it. And even what people would consider a competitor, but by sharing it, you grow even more, and people share and give. What were some of the things that you learned? What were some of the advice they gave you when you were starting the Startup Factory?
Yeah, probably the best piece of advice came from David Cohen, which he said, you're going to have a tendency, and you're going to talk to people in the area, leaders, they're going to want to build a cluster, biotech, medical devices, marketing tech, real estate tech, whatever, insurance tech, because they're going to look at the assets. They're going to try to engineer an outcome. And the bottom line is, please don't do that. That stuff bubbles up from the bottom, isn't mandated from on top. And this is one of the core lessons that I coach and speak and consult with business leaders is they have these muscles that tell them that when they engineer things and when they structure things, that better outcomes will happen. And it doesn't work in startup communities. The very people that make up the community abhor structure, right? They like to break things. Entrepreneurs are change agents. So the very thing you're trying to help them with, they then push away from, and you alienate the entrepreneurs. So he said, don't alienate, let them, they'll bubble up from various industries or companies, and just be open to all of them for at least the first 3 years.
One of the things, Chris, I love about you and some of the most successful people that I've had a chance to interview is about not having a lot of ego, and being humble, because you could have been like, listen, I done this. I was all over the country. I started this really successful company. I know how to do this, right? But even though it's a different model, right? And there was a humbleness and not ego about it, going to others for help, even though you have gone through and had successful companies before. How do you talk to founders? You want to have somewhat of an ego, right? And be confident, but be humble. How does that fit into when you're giving advice or talking to founders?
Well, I think the best way to lead that is to lead by example. I don't show up with any ego or airs. I have confidence. There's things I know I'm good at. There's things I know I can, but I don't pretend to know all the answers. So you shouldn't pretend to know all the answers. And in fact, if you pretend you know all the answers, I know that you're full of shit, right? I already know we have a problem. And Jeremy, it's funny. One of the things I say just about every day is, listen, here's my thoughts, but I'm just one person. I don't know I know a little bit more than some on some things, but here's the thing. This is your company, your idea. Use my advice, don't use my advice. I'm going to sleep the same tonight regardless, right? And what I'm trying to signal with that is this is your company. What I would do is go out and talk to as many people as possible. There's a point of diminishing returns, of course, but go talk to 3, 5, 8 people about the challenges you have. Get that feedback, be open to that, ask good questions, have them share. There's a great way to do this, by the way. And then take that feedback and then make your decisions. And they're your decisions. I'll support you 100% on those, right? So that little bit, if you unpack that, that's me saying, I don't have the answer. By the way, if I knew the exact playbook, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. I'd be running it over and over again, building a Facebook every day, right? Or a Google. So we know you don't know all the questions, which means we don't even know all the answers. We know it's a process of discovery. So be open to what comes and build that mindset. And let me give you examples of how I live that every day. And that's the best. That's how I do it.
First of all, Chris, I want to thank you. I have one last question. I want to hear some of your favorite books of all time. But before you answer that, I want to point people back to your website, Heivly.com, Heivly.com. You can check them out. Obviously, the book, Build the Fort, the Startup Community Builders Field Guide. You mentioned Brad Feld's book. What other books, and I'm looking, if you're watching the video, there's a big bookshelf behind you. What are some of your favorites?
2 books that I recommend to every new founder are Lean Startup by Eric Ries and Running Lean by Ash Maura, Mauyra. Those are 2 books. There's my Bible. When I run workshops with people with ideas, I'm going to run through those principles with them. One of my old school favorites is a book called Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. That was our Bible back in the 80s and 90s. What I love about that, and probably not a day goes by that I don't bring up a couple charts from that book that I've recreated and I hold up in front of the screen when I'm talking to a founder, is the idea in this kind of go slow, kind of crawl, walk, run kind of approach to this is the idea of early adopters and innovators. We know, many of us know the phrase early adopters, but we don't really know where it comes from. That's from Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm.
Love it.
There's 3 or 4 for you.
Love it. I want to be the first one to thank you, Chris. Thanks for sharing your knowledge, and thanks for meeting with so many people on a weekly basis to help them out. And people can learn more check out more episodes of the podcast and check out Heivly.com. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jeremy.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sailing right now. I'm feeling like $100 grand.